While Frasier Crane is the eponymous central character of Frasier, it's his brother Niles, played by David Hyde Pierce, who consistently steals the show. Frasier is at least as much about manners and class distinctions as it is about family, psychology, and radio shows. No one expresses the iconic sitcom's satirical send-up of class-based social politics better than Niles Crane, with his innumerable withering put-downs of those around him, including his brother. One of the best ongoing gags of the series is Niles' total infatuation with Daphne Moon, a working-class housekeeper who couldn't be more different from him. Yet, Frasier himself partakes in his fair share of class snobbery, particularly when encouraged by Niles. There's very little to choose between the Crane brothers while they are both engaged in looking down their noses at someone, except that, more often than not, we find Frasier more of a likable character than his brother. This subtle difference in our relative sympathies as an audience is no accident. In fact, one quote from David Hyde Pierce in a 1993 interview explains why we find Niles too snobbish for his own good, whereas Frasier's haughtiness is more tolerable. How Niles was explained to David Hyde Pierce. Niles was like Frasier but with one key difference. Speaking to the New York Times just before Frasier premiered on NBC in 1993, Pierce explained that his character had been pitched to him as what Frasier would be if he had never gone to Boston and never been exposed to the people at Cheers. Of course, the show Frasier famously spun off from Cheers, the original sitcom starring Kelsey Grammer's character Frasier Crane as part of an ensemble cast of unlikely drinking buddies in a Boston bar. Pierce was referring to the years that Kelsey Grammer's Frasier had spent drinking at Cheers Bar, immersed him in the social norms of down-to-earth working-class people, something that Niles never got to experience. As a result, Frasier has developed the ability to code-switch effectively between the lofty pretensions that he and his brother share and the more grounded sensibilities of their father, Martin, as well as Daphne. Niles, on the other hand, hasn't developed this ability at all and only sees one code worth adhering to. Consequently, he isn't able to see the funny side of his own pretentiousness, which, naturally, makes him even funnier as a sitcom character. It also places him on a slightly different plane from Frasier himself, giving the show's protagonist room to punch up at Niles with his jokes occasionally. Frasier really highlights just how different Frasier Crane was in Boston. In Cheers, he was fully immersed in working-class pub humor. David Hyde Pierce's quote about Niles being Frasier without having lived in Boston is even more insightful than he probably realized at the time. The quote not only explains Niles Crane's differences from Frasier, but it also explains why the version of Frasier himself that we see in his own show differs so much from Frasier in Cheers. Frasier deliberately plays up the pretentious and haughty demeanor shared by both Frasier Crane and his brother Niles, and contrasts it with the plain speaking of Martin Crane, Daphne, and Roz Doyle. By contrast, in Cheers we see Frasier immersed in Boston's working-class drinking culture. Throughout his 9 seasons on Cheers, Frasier Crane certainly never hid his professional status, education, or appreciation of the finer things in laughter. Yet he was also always the first to involve himself in mischief and distinguished himself primarily through bad puns and his infectious, honking laugh. In Frasier, meanwhile, he's more reserved and appears to aspire to the same snobbish ideals as his brother, to the extent that in the Season 3 episode High Crane Drifter, he goes on a tirade about common courtesy, screaming from his balcony about the people of Seattle behaving like barbarians. Frasier's reboot never quite got his return to Boston right. The new Frasier Crane is stuck halfway between Seattle and Cheers. The marked contrast between the character of Frasier Crane in Cheers and the different version we saw of him in Frasier's original run set up a tricky predicament for the show's writers when it came to its 2023 revival. The premise of this reboot was that Frasier had returned to Boston to reconnect with his son, a fireman with working-class Bostonian manners. Frasier Crane couldn't go full Cheers again since fans of Frasier had gotten used to his Seattle persona throughout 11 seasons. The showrunners tried to remedy this potential problem by giving Frasier a Niles replacement in the form of Nicholas Lyndhurst's Alan Cornwall. However, while Alan was arguably the Frasier revival's biggest success, a somewhat looser Frasier Crane, halfway between his Seattle and Cheers personas, didn't quite land. The Frasier Crane of 2023 was open to pub jollies, fancy dress, and casual attire, despite still extolling the same pretensions that generated so many laughs throughout the 90s and early 2000s. It didn't quite match up, and Kelsey Grammer's character ended up playing second fiddle to an array of more interesting supporting characters in this new iteration of Frasier.